And here you see Seleukos lion ball status with a more simplified mint control on top. Seleukos also chose the anchor for the Susarith coins that bear the name of Alexander and are now down-dated to the period from 311 to 308. At that time, Antigonos had recaptured Babylon, while Seleukos was on his eastern campaign. Thus, he had to rely on the Susa mint for the payment of his soldiers. Anchors, here you can see the wreath and the anchor. Anchors also appear on the Alexander tetradrachms, which were issued around 308-307 until Seleukos was proclaimed king in 305, and again after his victory at Ipsos in 301. So here you can see some later coins. His choice has been debated in scholarship for half a century, during which our approach to the Seleukids changed to incorporate their interest in local, that is, non-Greek traditions. Seleukos became king in Babylon and engaged thoroughly with Babylonian traditions, which may hold the key to explaining the anchor iconography. Still, we must review the numismatic evidence and the suggestions put forward so far. According to Newell, anchors on Alexander-type coins were likely minted first at Aradus in Phoenicia, after Seleukos took over the city's mint as Ptolemy's admiral in 316. Newell relied on the similarity of Seleukos anchor coins with issues minted at Aradus by Philip III, who was executed in 317. He also argued that Alexanders with anchors were minted at Marathos, and here you can see a sample. Houghton, however, disagreed and divided these coins into 4 groups. Groups 3 and 4 are dated around 300 to 301, so at the time of the Issos battle. Group 1 is dated the earliest, around 311 to 306. Houghton showed that these coins were most probably minted in the East. He further associated Group 2 with the anchor lion statters that we just saw, but the ones that were minted at Babylon after 305. In his view, these coins disappeared when the mint was transferred from Babylon to Seleucia on the Tigris. He argued that Seleucia was built as a Greek city, which lacked Babylon's Oriental associations. Mind you, however, Pausanias noted that Seleucia had many Babylonian colonists. When the anchor reappears, we find it on bronze coins and quadruples minted after the Battle of Ipsos, and on the Athena elephant chariot coins minted probably at Seleucia's second workshop, some years after the mint was transferred from Babylon, so around 304. So you can see a sample of these coins here. One suggestion rehashed over the years, and I'll come back to this slide for a minute, is that Seleukos chose the anchor to celebrate his career as Ptolemy's admiral against Antigonos from 315 to 312. Since the Seleucia anchor coins feature elephants, which of course points to Ptolemy's favorite coin symbol, Seleukos' closeness to Ptolemy is further established in some of these arguments. However, for Hadley, who argued that the anchor was first minted after 305 at Ecbatana and Susa, these victories had occurred too many years ago to bear any meaning. Similarly, Antela Bernarders in 2009 noted that surely at the time of his accession to the throne, Seleukos would not have liked to remind his subjects that he was until recently Ptolemy's subservient. Seleukos' ascension required symbols of his own worth as a king. As Taylor argued, and now it's time for me to go back to the slide, Seleucus experimented widely with his coin symbols during the Babylonian War. By the end of it, it was pretty clear that the anchor had become a dynastic symbol. But for whom mainly is the question. We'll come back to this question in a minute. Appian had reported, as we all know, two relevant legends about Seleucus, one involving a ring with an anchor engraved on it, and one about Seleucus stumbling near Babylon over a stone which proved to be an anchor. In that story, Ptolemy intervened to declare that this is no sign of worry at all. On the contrary, it's a sign of safety, and therefore he inspired Seleucus to use the anchor in his signet ring. At this point, one must take a closer look at Seleukid's anchors. On the coins, we seem to have variations of the fluked stone-stocked wooden anchors that are commonly found across the Mediterranean. Or rather, while these are the common anchors found across the Mediterranean, Seleucus seems to have used a lead-stocked anchor on his coins. Although lead-stocked anchors are used widely in the Roman period, knowledge of them certainly exists at this stage. In Greek colonies, such as Apollonia Pontica, an early colony of Miletus, anchors were used on coins in combination with Apollo, which of course is Seleucus' divine father. Also in combination with Medusa, which still features in some Seleukid coins. Appian, however, in his text, specifies that Seleucus stumbled upon a stone, which is subsequently discovered to be an anchor. Therefore, the representation of the anchor varies between coins and textual tradition. Appian's description seems to be pointing to the more common type of stone anchor, which is punctuated with a number of holes, and these holes, 1 or 3 holes, and these holes were used to connect the anchor to a rope or to add wooden stakes to it. We do know of the Celtic significance of stone anchors punctuated with a hole and set up in temples or sacred sites across the Levant already since the Bronze Age. Here you have they are called in the Jewish context, schifons or schiffonim. Here you have one from Washman, and here from Frost's main work on this, a number of pictures of such schiffonim. Dedicating parts of a ship to show gratitude for safe sailing was also widely known among the Greeks. Callimachus, therefore, in the Hellenistic period, mentions that Agamemnon had dedicated the rudder of his ship to the goddess Imbrasia, and Apollonius Rhodius notes that the Argonauts dedicated an anchor to the spring Ardaki. I have listed the references on the slide. Furthermore, a dedication of a silver model ship in the name of King Seleucus is listed in the Delian inventory catalogues a few years after his death. Would this be a deathbed wish fulfilled? Although I have to say that the date of the inscription is debated. Seleucus, therefore, expected his subjects to recognize the technologically advanced anchor as a development of the traditional stone anchor, and further to invest it with the Celtic ideology that stone anchors typically carried. But how did Seleucus expect his subjects to recognize the anchor's meaning on his earlier coins minted in the East? Before we go back to this question, let us see what other scholars have already put forward as an explanation to why Seleucus chose the anchor. Hadley suggested that after Ipsos, Seleucus was likely seeking to win the goodwill of Greek merchants, who at the time were keen to reintegrate the commercial network all the way from the Mediterranean eastward to Iran and the Persian Gulf. Seleucus was certainly keen to fulfill Alexander's naval plans because he had commissioned the periplus of the Caspian Sea in order to expand his presence in the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, he had already sailed the Euphrates along Alexander, as we saw in the text earlier, receiving, during which campaign, he received yet another omen of his royal future in the marshes near Babylon. Although there is no anchor in this story, clearly the tale is tied to his royal future. In addition, the Diadochi Chronicle mentions that Seleucus wrested Babylon from Antigonos via the Euphrates, possibly by damaging earthwork defenses along the riverbanks. The anchor engraved ring also featured in the story of Pompeius Trocus and therefore in Justin's epitome of that. Here the emphasis falls on Apollo as Seleucus' divine father, which represents a later and complementary process of legitimization. Reference is made to Seleucus' anchor-shaped birthmark, which was carried by several of his descendants. And I think that that's something mostly for the discussion. I think it's very interesting that Seleucus and his descendants are said to carry this birthmark on the thigh, and then in some of the early coins, the anchor is etched on the hatch or high on the back leg of the lion in the Baal studders. Just an idea. Antela Bernardes again understood the anchor in connection with the victory of Ptolemy and his allies, including Seleucus, against Demetrios in the Battle of Rhodes in 305. Demetrios had chosen to strike coins bearing a Nike on a ship's prow around 300. And of course, this was a very political movement, a reminder to the other successors of his victory over Ptolemy and of his claim to royalty. Nevertheless, Seleucus, by that time, had already minted his own anchors before. So why would he revisit the symbol in connection to someone else's victory and in a multi-party agreement? From a coin's perspective, Lorber and Iosif, also keen on Ptolemy's role, observed that the gold and double darics with the image of Alexander in elephant headdress and anchors were issued at Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana in 311 BCE, when Seleucus won control of these cities with cavalry provided by Ptolemy. But again, in my view, in 311, engraving coins to honor Ptolemy was not a priority for Seleucus. Seleucus minted the early anchor coins in the east, as we said, to pay his non-Greek soldiers. Why would Ptolemy be even flattered by such a movement? And who would recognize it? In his 2015 revision of the issue, Taylor argued that Series 2 of the Alexanders minted at the uncertain Mint 6A, 70 kilometers north of Babylon, were struck after Seleucus had expelled Antigonos from Babylonia in 308, or rather probably between 306 and 304, in preparation for the return of his army from his eastern campaign. Again, who remembers Seleucus' naval victories at this time? Do they matter for the soldiers that took part in the eastern campaign? And of course, to make matters more complicated, because there weren't that much so far, from 304 to 301, Seleucus seems to have abandoned or tried to abandon the anchor from his coins. We now believe that this was a conscious decision because anchors were erased from Seleukid coin dies across his mints operating in Babylon, so Babylon II and the uncertain mint 6A, and Susiana. Taylor posits two reasons as to why the erasure of anchors happened. This is, of course, close to the time of Seleucus' ascension to the throne. First, he now had a legend, a royal legend, Basileos Seleukou, which established unambiguously the issuing authority, making the anchor redundant. Second, the anchor could have been perceived as implying subservience to Ptolemy. Now, this is what Andela Bernarders and myself have been telling from the beginning, but I also think that the subservience to Ptolemy would be a concern for Seleucus from the beginning, not the same in 311 and in 305. Taylor also argues that the reintroduction of the anchor on Seleucus coins after Ipsos was an attempt to further secure the loyalty of the predominantly non-Macedonian population in his realm by presenting it as an inevitable outcome of the will of the gods. Taylor believes that these later coins are of civic character, and I agree with him. In my view, furthermore, the royal legend, written in Greek, would be of little use to Seleucus' non-Greek subjects, so the introduction of the anchor was necessary, or the reintroduction of the anchor, in my mind, would be necessary for that. The last argument I want to present to you before we move on to my theory is that of Apergis 2020. Although Taylor believes that these coins were issued in a civic context, Apergis insists that these coins are military, and they were used to pay returning soldiers and those who continued to serve in peacetime after the Battle of Ipsos. Apergis seems to understand a number of coins in military context. So the anchor on victory coins from the Susa mint were, according to him, one-off payments for the Bactrian soldiers who returned from Ipsos and regular pay for those who remained in the army. He also argued that the Alexander anchor coins that were struck at Babylon II early in the Babylonian War and then were supplemented with coins from the Ecbatana mint no later than 305 were also used to pay the infantry and the cavalry, but in this order. Seleucus used the horned horse symbol to pay the Median cavalry, obviously making the connection between the horse head and cavalry, and his anchor coins for the main army infantry. When we have coins that include both symbols, then according to Apergis, they were used for payment either both the infantry and the cavalry. In his view, even the silver Baal lion coins with anchors from that period were payments for the native troops which had served in the army earlier, from 311 to 309. And he explains the anchor erasure as something that happened after the departure of the army from Babylon for the Eastern campaign, when certain coins found their way back to Babylon, but were now had to be reissued for general use from 308 onwards. Now, this interpretation, in my mind, does not consider the fact that anchor erasures happened at the same time in Susa and Babylon, which, as we said, points to a more centrally guided policy. Neither do I see a reason as to why would Seleucus want to differentiate between his civic issues and his military issues, especially when the coins, the early lion anchor coins, were an emulation of Mazeus's civic issues. At any rate, Apergis registers the interest of Seleucus in the cultural preferences or cultural sensitivities of his subjects. And we do know from the chronicles that he took an interest, or at least the priests at Babylon approached him with certain requests to which he seemed to have responded. On one occasion, we don't know whether he paid the money to have the temple of Marduk cleaned, but on another chronicle, Chronicle 9, we do know that he had something to do with the procession of Bel. In any way, he did not object to being portrayed as a traditional Babylonian king. The phenomenon of anchor erasures is not observed in Seleucus' Western satrapies, since the most important Seleukid mints here were established around 300. On these coins, the legend of the king is commonly engraved alongside the anchor on coins intended for civic consumption. Therefore, Seleucus issued coins with the anchor of the reverse of his Antioch mint, the mint of Apamia on the Orontes, and the Pergamum mint. And I have included some issues from these mints on the slide. Although the erasures are on military issues, I think that Seleucus realized that he ought to keep reminding his citizens of his profile as a paragon of peace and stability. And this symbol was equally suitable for his soldiers and for his citizens, for the Greeks and for the non-Greeks of his empire. The projection of the king as a restorer of order on earth in emulation of the king of gods is a very Babylonian concept. That Babylonian royal ideology was considerably widespread across Syria and the Levant. Perhaps Seleucus adopted the anchor to pose as Marduk's protege. That would explain why he tried to abandon it after securing his rule, only to realize that the anchor was too powerful a symbol for his non-Greek subjects, or for all his subjects. The cult of Marduk was previously used by the Assyrian Sargon II for political gain. He explicitly wanted to merge Assyria and Babylonia politically and culturally. During the Hellenistic period, the Babylonian priests actively tried to revive the god's annual festival while posing as guardians of cuneiform culture. At Babylon, Marduk was identified with the Baal of Tarsos, which we know from Mazeus' coins, as well as Zeus and Heracles. Furthermore, naval victories were important for Near Eastern kings such as Sargon I, the founder of the Akkadian dynasty. Alongside the widespread commemoration of naval victories on royal inscriptions, the concept of anchoring the state in safety features notably in Near Eastern literary texts that continued to be copied down to the first millennium. These texts influenced, of course, the Babylonian celebration of the festival of Marduk, who sailed triumphantly to his city. I don't say that the ancient festival remained unchanged down the centuries. I actually think that at the time of the Hellenistic period, the Babylonian priests, while portraying themselves as the captors of tradition, managed to introduce a number of innovations, but these innovations are neither here nor there when it comes to the main argument of Babylonian royal ideology, the king as restorer of peace, the handler of cosmic order, the handler of the cosmic rope of anchoring the ship of state. One more practical question that one may ask is, what kind of knowledge of Mediterranean ships and their anchors did the peoples of the ancient Near East have? Here, I can add this. Cities like Uruk and Ur on the banks of the Euphrates were key to riverine transport of goods, and importantly, they had connected the Persian Gulf with Mesopotamia for centuries, given that the Gulf waters extended significantly further inland compared to nowadays. The Assyrians were long engaged in sea battles, that's what they called them, against rebellious groups in the marshes of Babylonia. The very marshes were described in the Assyrian dialect as the sea land, Mat Tamti. However, in these battles, they did employ the typical reed boat familiar to us from all over Mesopotamia. Still, we have several representations from Assyrian palaces, including Nineveh, where Phoenician warships are represented. In all probability, these are ships built and manned by Phoenicians for Sennacherib, who boasted to have captured sailors from Tyre, Sidon, and Cyprus before resettling them in the Tigris. Following the example of Naram-Sin, who boasted to have washed his weapons in the lower sea, i.e. the Persian Gulf, and the king of Mari, who made great offerings befitting his kingship to the sea and drove his soldiers to swim to the sea, later Neo-Assyrian kings were equally interested in sailing the Mediterranean and making their presence felt in the Gulf. The naval ambitions of Nebuchadnezzar II, recorded by Abydinos, were still reported at the time of Eusebius. Nebuchadnezzar built the harbor city of Teredon at the mouth of the Euphrates, as well as the colony of Gera opposite the islands of Bahrain. Even Alexander himself was said to have built ships in Phoenicia, which he then ordered to be disassembled and carried and carried to the city of Thapsacos in the Euphrates. At Thapsacos, they were reassembled to allow him to sail down to Babylon. Thus, even if maritime anchors were not part of everyday life in Mesopotamia, knowledge of them was widespread and could be readily associated with the Near Eastern concept of anchoring the ship of state. The trope was not only employed in the context of Marduk's festival once a year, but also in royal inscriptions and popular literature. Nearly 2 centuries after Sargon, a royal inscription of Gudea of Lagash commemorates his naval successes. The inscription, interestingly, is copied from a Sargonic statue, which is dated sometime between the Ur III period and the early Old Babylonian period, and includes references to ships from Melucha, Magan, and Dilmun that Sargon managed to moor at the quay of Akkad. The inscription offers testament to the way naval campaigns informed Near Eastern ideologies 2 millennia before Seleucus even set foot in the region. These are not isolated examples. So here we have more inscriptions from Sargon and even from his son, Manishtusu, claiming to have loaded onto ships and anchored the ships on the quay of Akkad, all sorts of booty that he managed to get from the lower sea regions. In the Sumerian text that we read before, Gudea presents himself as the one who tows the boat of Enlil, which reminds us not only the importance of the king's connection to the chief god, but also the fact that Near Eastern deities typically traveled by boat either to fight their enemies or celebrate their festivals. The remaining of Gudaia's inscription reads, "His lady he arranged therein, he constructed for Ningirsu his beloved boat, named having set sail from the lofty quay, and he moored it for him at the lapis lazuli quay of Kazura. Is this a cultic ship? He enrolled for Ningirsu the sailors and their captain, donating them for the house of his master." These notions were really widespread in Sumerian literature and were copied down or continue to be copied down to the 1st century BCE. For example, Ninurta, a widely accepted prototype for Heracles, is described in the Sumerian Lugale epic as riding his boat. His boat has a name and it's called Makamuntea. And that means boat issuing out of the princely quay. Importantly, Ninurta becomes a king only when his boatmen address Enlil, the chief god, on his behalf. Ninurta's royal qualities were later transferred to the Assyrian Ashur and eventually to the Babylonian Marduk, who is said to travel, in the form of his statue, of course, to his New Year festival by boat. Marduk's boat is none other than his defeated enemy, the terrible sea monster Tiamat. So Marduk is seen riding it during his New Year festivities. Marduk's boat in the Babylonian ritual does correspond to the more ancient boat of Ninurta. Further, in the ancient Babylonian mind of or their conception of the world, Babylon stands in the center, surrounded by a river, which by the 1st millennium becomes synonymous with sea. The word is Tamtu. You can hear it, Tiamat Tamtu. Numerous miniature boats were produced every year for Marduk's festival, reminding the citizens of this tradition. Furthermore, see also a clay barrel of Nebuchadnezzar II, bought in London in 1888 and currently at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The text on it describes the restoration of temples of Marduk and Nabu in Babylon and Borsippa and refers to the god's magnificent state boats. Nebuchadnezzar's inscription, furthermore, from Wadi Brisa, echoes the king's preoccupation with decorating the god's cultic ship. The inscription was written on the representation of the king fighting a lion. You can see the draft below on the slide, which alludes to the Babylonian conquest of Lebanon in 605-604. Given how important Nebuchadnezzar was as a royal model for the Seleukids, his inscriptions suggest another possible pathway through which Seleukos and his son may have come across the notion of sailing the ship of state in its Near Eastern context. To conclude, the anchor had been in Seleukos' mind since the early days of reclaiming Babylon from Antigonos. He minted coins bearing anchors at both Babylon and Susa as payment for his soldiers during the Babylonian War and the Anabasis eastward that followed. As anchor erasures in both mints indicate, he stopped using the anchor around 304 and for a few years until after the Battle of Ipsos. Then the anchor reappears in a number of coins distributed across the empire, increasingly so in a civic context. The introduction of the anchor had little to do, therefore, with Ptolemy or his Seleukos' early naval career, and is most probably part of Seleukos' attempt to legitimize his rule. In building, however, his propaganda, Seleukos could not ignore the widespread Babylonian traditions which previous rulers, especially Nebuchadnezzar II, had already proliferated in southern Syria and the Levant. Posing as the next favorite of Heracles Marduk, Seleukos employed the metaphor of guiding the ship of state to safe mooring, creating a common ideological reference for both his Greco-Macedonian and Near Eastern subjects. Thank you very, very much for your